Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's exercise session, which will be the second paper session of this lecture, where we will deal with the topic of public goods. I think by now you should have gotten some insights into the theory of public goods due to the lecture, and I will talk about two papers in this session, which you might be familiar with due to the lecture. So in particular, we will talk about the seminal paper by Samuelson, which was published in 1954 and has the title The Pure Theory of Public Expenditure. So you encountered this paper in Proposition 1 on, I think, slide 6 or something on the lecture slides for the topic of public goods. And this is basically the paper which builds the foundation for this proposition. And then we will talk about a paper by Atkinson and Stern from 1974 with the title Pigou Taxation in Public Goods, which is building upon the Samuelson paper. And in particular, it's criticizing the Samuelson condition in not being precisely capturing the effects that public good expenditure has, or the financing of public good expenditure has, when you're using taxes which cause distortion. Because in the Samuelson paper, lump sum taxes are used to finance public good, which cause no distortion, and it might differ when you are considering commodity taxes or income taxes. So let's start with the outline. So the Samuelson paper is basically one of the first papers which is conducting rigorous analysis on the topic of public goods. By this I mean that it's using kind of economic theory to give insights into optimality related to public good expenditure and the output of public goods, basically. So given that we are facing an economy with consumers who can produce and can consume and have preferences, what is the optimal amount of the public good or the public goods that we should produce? And he basically derives necessary conditions for an allocation. So an allocation means an allocation of inputs and outputs across the consumers in the economy. So he derives necessary conditions for an allocation to be Pareto efficient. And the new aspect here is that the conditions include public goods which are non-excludable. Yes, non-excludable would mean that it's self-explanatory actually. So consumption of the public good by one consumer does not exclude consumption of other consumers. And the so-called Samuelson condition is now giving kind of a necessary condition for the amount of public good which is produced to be efficient, to be Pareto efficient. And then Samuelson continues to argue that in order to implement this allocation, we cannot rely on a decentralized market solution, so where prices would yield so where we would use decentralized prices, which are determined in a market, to solve or get to this allocation, which he derives. And he argues that if we would have a decentralized market solution, this would lead to inefficiencies. And I will be clear about why this is the case when we talk about this paper. The second paper by Atkinson and Stern is arguing that the optimality as it is stated in the Samuelson paper can only be achieved if lump sum taxes are feasible. So lump sum taxes are taxes where you simply subtract a fixed amount from everybody in the economy. And the point with lump sum taxes are that they do not create distortions because they don't change relative prices in the economy, but they're simply taking a fixed amount away from each individual. Yeah, so the prices are basically the same. The prices of the goods in the economy are the same, but everybody gets a decrease in his income basically. So the argument here is that if lump sum taxes are not feasible, feasible because of many reasons, then the optimization must include explicitly the way the tax is raised. Yeah, because the reason is that different tax schedules cause different types of distortions, and this has an impact on the real cost of a public good. Yeah, so when you consider the Samuelson condition from the lecture, you saw that the sum of marginal utilities of the public good for all the individuals in the economy must equal the production cost. And the argument in this paper here is that the real cost should include the way that the public good is financed, and then there will be a different condition, as we will see. But yeah, let's start with the Samuelson paper. Oh, so there is a mistake here. I copied the last slides from the last paper presentation. So of course this should be the title of the Samuelson paper here. So the paper is actually starting by observing that in that time, the economic theorists have neglected the theory of or the topic of optimal public expenditure. So the focus was rather on the theory of taxation. Yeah, so theory of taxation, in that how should we optimally tax in order to raise some particular amount of revenue for finance some things. And public expenditure is more kind of concerned with the question with how much should we, or how much of a public good should we kind of provide given the preferences in the economy. And Samuelson is building a theoretical model of public expenditure. So he's kind of developing a theory of public expenditure by assuming that there exist public goods in an economy which are non-excludable. And I mentioned before what this exactly means. So in addition to private goods, so goods which are excludable in that consumption of a private good by one consumer leads to exclusion of the consumption of another consumer. So those are private goods. And now we also have public goods in the model, and they differ in the way that they're modeled. So let me briefly introduce the model. So there are n private goods, denoted by capital X1 to capital Xn, and there are S individuals in the economy. So capital X with low index J and high index I denotes consumer I's consumption of private good J. Okay, so it is basically, if we have an allocation, this here is telling us how much of private good J, so the quantity of private good J that consumer I is consuming. Then we also have a notation for the total consumption of a good J, which is then capital X with low index J, and this is simply the sum of individual consumptions of the private good. Yeah, so summing up over all individuals in the economy. So the new thing here is that in addition to the private goods, there are M non-excludable public goods, which we then denote by capital X n plus 1 to capital X n plus M. So in total, we have M public goods here. And the main difference to the private goods is that they're non-excludable, and hence, as a consequence, the individual consumptions of the public good will always be equal to the total amount of the public good which is available in the economy. Yeah, so this is the main difference to the private goods. So consumers have preferences over the goods in the economy, so both over the private goods and over the public goods. And the preferences are represented by utility function, which is stated here, which then depends simply on all the goods which are available in the economy. And there is a further notation in that we sometimes we care about the marginal utility of a good, and this will be denoted by UJI. So this is the marginal utility of good J for consumer I. And keep in mind that in the paper of Samuelson, the consumers can be heterogeneous because we have an index I here, like a high index I here. So consumers do not need to have the same preferences, and hence the marginal utilities of the consumers can also differ. Yep. So we have heterogeneity in the model here. And this is basically, so the marginal utility is describing the marginal utility that an individual gets if we marginally increase his consumption of a particular good J. Now the goods, not only the goods, but actually it's the private goods. So the private goods. So the private goods are divided into outputs and inputs. And outputs are goods which are consumed, and inputs are goods which are used to produce outputs and public goods. Okay, so you use the inputs to produce either private good outputs or the public good. And inputs could be resources, for instance, as wood or something like this, or it could also be labor. And production in this economy is basically represented by the following equation. So capital F is a function which maps basically all the goods in the economy that we have into a production possibility frontier, and it's described by this equation here. So this is a kind of a way to setting this equal to 0, we are basically modeling kind of a production possibility frontier, which is telling us how much we can maximally produce given the inputs in the economy. Yeah, so this is a way to model it. And it will not be super important. Like the way that it's modeled in the paper is a little bit more complicated than you would learn it in a normal microeconomic course. But just keep in mind that this equation is simply saying or stating how much we can produce in the economy. And the condition here, or the assumption here, is basically stating that production increases if we increase the amount of an input. Or sorry, it's saying that how do you say, we need more inputs to increase the amount of an output in this economy, basically. So the statement is, if we increase the output of a good in this economy, then this condition, and since this output causes capital F to increase, then in order for this condition to be still fulfilled, so this being equal to 0, we need to decrease the output of another good. So this is basically representing the trade-off that we have when we're producing some output. Let it be a private good or a public good. So there is also a social welfare function, which is denoted by capital U, and this maps from the utilities of the individuals, so the individual utilities, into a real number, which is then representing the social welfare utility that, for instance, a social planner derives from the utility of the consumers. And the only assumption which is made here in the paper is that the marginal social utility is strictly increasing in the utility of the individuals in the economy. Yeah, so this paper here, at least at this point, is abstracting from concerns of equality. So we're not saying that the social welfare function is strictly concave or it's strictly convex or anything like this, but we're simply saying that the social welfare function is strictly increasing in the indirect utilities of the consumers of the economy, and that's all that we have here. So we abstract from equality concerns and other concerns. Now, given what we derived so far, we can write down the optimization problem of a social planner, and basically so the social planner is maximizing the social welfare function such that we so this is a budget constraint basically, representing production's possibility frontier, so what we are capable of producing in this economy. And the social planner is maximizing over the allocation basically. So how much of the private good is consumed. So how much of the output private goods is consumed by each of the consumers, how much input each consumer needs to supply, and what is the amount of the public good which is produced in this economy. This is covered here by this sequence, and this is the optimization problem of the social planner. Now, if we write down the the first order conditions, we can summarize them in the following way. So we have three conditions where basically the second condition here is an adjusted version. So it's a more general version of the Samuelson condition that you saw. And the first condition is kind of a condition which is in general summarizing Pareto efficiency if there would be only private goods. The second condition is summarizing the condition for, or summarizing it's a necessary condition for Pareto efficiency of the amount of public goods which are produced in the economy. And the third condition here is basically representing kind of an allocation. So depending on what structure we impose on the social welfare function, this then would give us a unique solution to the from the Pareto efficient allocations of the public and the private goods. Yeah, but since we're not imposing any further structure on the social welfare function, this condition doesn't help us in uniquely determining an allocation among the Pareto efficient allocations. Yeah, so just to summarize the first order conditions, so any allocation which fulfills condition 1 is Pareto efficient with respect to the private goods. Okay, so this is nothing new. This was derived before. So this was not due to Samuelson, at least in this paper. This condition was derived in a previous book, I think, which, basically was the first kind of rigorous analysis on how kind of allocation should look like in a Pareto optimum. And the condition 1 is basically saying that for all goods and all individuals, the marginal rates of the marginal rate of substitution with respect to the preferences should be equal to the marginal to the technical rate of substitution. Yeah? So this is a condition of Pareto efficiency for private goods when we are producing the private goods using inputs. Yeah? So typically, what you would have in a model where we do not have production, but we simply have endowments and prices of the goods, and they can be simply produced at no cost by not at no cost, but they can be simply so they simply exist without being produced. Then you would have the right-hand side here simply being equal to the ratio of prices. So this is a typical thing that you get in a partial equilibrium model where the marginal rate of substitution must equal the relative price. And since we have production here, the relative prices of the goods are represented by the costs of producing them. And this is the reason why we basically have the marginal rate of technical substitution on the right-hand side. And this must be equal for all individuals and all goods, all private goods, in order to have fulfill Pareto efficiency with respect to the private goods. So an allocation which fulfills condition 3 is maximizing social welfare. So this would be this condition here. And this condition, as I stated before, since we do not impose any structure on the social welfare function, we cannot use this condition to pin down one unique solution among the Pareto efficient allocations that we have summarized by condition 1 and 2. But we have more than one solution here. And the new thing here is condition 2. And condition 2 is basically saying that if we have an allocation which fulfills it, then it is Pareto efficient with respect to the public goods. So if an allocation fulfills condition 1 and 2, then we have full Pareto efficiency in this economy. And condition 2 is actually the so-called Samuelson condition. And I will show you how it links to what you saw in proposition 1 on the lecture slides. So if we have one private good and one public good, and we denote the public good with simply the index J, if we have quasi-linear utility, which means that we have a private good, which is the numeraire good, and it flows linearly into the utility, and the utility of the public good can be a concave or convex or whatever function. This is what we had in lecture slides. And if we have constant unit production costs of C for the public good, then condition 2 is actually becoming this condition here. Okay, so condition 2, which we have here, will be basically given by this condition here. And this is saying that the sum of marginal utilities for the individual, the marginal individual utility for the public goods should equal the production cost of the public good. And the reason why this condition 2 here is basically then kind of reducing to the Samuelson condition is because first of all we just have one public good and one private good, and since we have quasi-linear utility, the marginal utilities of the private goods will simply be 1, so they will disappear from this denominator here. So this will be equal to 1. And also, since we only use the numeraire good to produce the public good, then and the production cost is equal to C, measured the numeric cost, this will be then equal to C if we have the assumptions that I made on this slide here. Yeah, this should remind you of condition 2 in proposition 1, and it's on slide 6 of chapter 2 of the lecture. Yeah, so this is the relationship between the Samuelson condition that you saw and the Samuelson condition in the paper. And if we take the more general condition, so condition 2 here, let me just erase this again. So if we're considering this condition here, so what it is actually explicitly saying about how much of the public good we should, or public goods we should produce in this economy. And basically it depends on two factors. First, it depends on, so the condition is basically saying that we should produce more of a public good J if the marginal utilities for the public goods, so J, of the consumers are relatively high compared to the marginal utilities of the private goods. Yeah, because whenever we produce a particular amount of the public good, there is a cost to this. So it's the production cost of it, and it's also the opportunity cost because we could have produced another good and not the public good that we are producing. Yeah, so instead of producing a public good, we can produce more of the private goods, which we then allocate to the individuals. So the argument here is that if there is a public good J for which consumers have particularly high preferences, so high utility, relative to the utilities that they have with respect to the private goods, we should produce more of this public good. Yeah, so this is kind of saying that the opportunity costs of producing a public good should be relatively low in order for us to produce more of this public good. Then in addition, so this here is the argument about opportunity costs with respect to preferences of the other goods which are in the economy. The second condition here is pinning down the production cost of the public good. So we should produce more of a public good J if the production costs of the public good J are relatively low compared to the production cost of the private goods. Yeah? So this is kind of abstracting from preferences. This is then simply saying that, so abstracting from preferences for the outputs. So this is basically saying that if we can produce the the public good in a cheap way relative to the private goods, we should increase the output of this public goods. Yeah, and this is kind of what's reflected in condition 2 here on this slide in a more complicated way, but that's the basic intuition that you have. Okay, there is one remaining question in this paper, which is then, how shall we implement the allocation? Okay, so we kind of determined the necessary conditions for Pareto efficiency and like one condition for a social optimum. But the question arises now, how can we implement such an allocation? So how can we kind of get to this solution that I showed you before? And the question is, if there is no social planner, is there a decentralized market solution which yields an allocation which fulfills conditions 1 to 3? And Samuelson, so decentralized market solution would be kind of a solution with prices. So all the consumers are maximizing their utility by themselves. This kind of yields demand and supply in this market if we aggregate it. And then we end up with some decentralized prices, which then yield equal, like an equilibrium in this market. And as it would be the case if you would have only private goods. And Samuelson is arguing that no, we cannot reach like a solution, or a decentralized market solution cannot fulfill all three conditions as long as they are public goods. And in particular, what will be violated is condition 2, the Samuelson condition. And the reason is that if consumers are making independent choices, so this is a decentralized solution, then they do not internalize the positive externalities of public goods on other consumers. So since the public goods are non-excludable, a marginal increase of a public good increases the benefit that for all the consumers, not only for one consumer. But when a single consumer is solving his optimization problem, he's of course not internalizing these utilities, like the utilities of the other, or the increase in utility of the other individuals in the economy, because it's not part of his own utility function. At least if we assume that preferences are not altruistic, so the individuals only care about themselves. That's crucial here. And a consequence of this is that there will be an under provision of the public good. So if consumers maximize by themselves and we're looking at a decentralized market solution with decentralized prices, then we will have an under provision of the public good. So we will not have Pareto efficiency with respect to the public goods. Now, how can we solve this? So if there would be a social planner who has sufficient information about the true preferences of all individuals for the public good, then this problem could be solved, because the social planner then would allocate in such a way that the conditions 1 to 3 are fulfilled. So he would basically, give orders on how much each consumer is consuming and how much consuming of the outputs, private outputs, and how much they're contributing with respect to the inputs, and how much of the public goods are produced. And the social planner could use lump sum taxes to finance the production of the public goods. So you could take away some amount of the some amount of the inputs of the consumers in order to produce the public goods by lump sum taxes. But the crucial thing here is that the planner needs to know the true preferences. And this is a very strong assumption, because just imagine if you have a very high population, it's highly unlikely that you as a social planner know exactly what the true preferences of the individuals are. And one issue is that if you would ask the individuals by a survey or something like this, so for instance, you're thinking about building, I don't know, a new street somewhere, and you make it clear that it needs to be financed by taxes, then if you would ask the individuals what the preferences for this new street is, they would simply have an incentive to lie because yeah, they do not internalize the positive externality that the street is imposing on others, and hence they have an incentive to understate the true benefit of the street in order to pay less or contribute less for the production of this public good. Yeah, so if you would ask individuals to contribute on a voluntary basis to the production of a public good, then they would have an incentive to understate, and you would end up in a dilemma where the public good, for instance, in an extreme case, would not be provided. Okay, this finishes the Samuelson paper and brings us to the Atkinson paper. And in the last paper session, I created two videos because they were quite long. And the videos, so the video for this paper session will be much shorter, so I will put everything into one video. So the Atkinson-Stern paper in 1974 with the title Pigou Taxation and Public Goods is basically building upon the Samuelson paper in that it can be considered as an extension where you do not finance public goods by lump sum transfers or lump sum taxes, but by taxes which cause distortion. So the paper starts by arguing that the way that a public good is financed has an impact on welfare. Yeah, and basically the idea is that lump sum taxes do not cause distortions, and therefore they do not cause a change in the behavior of individuals. And yeah, there is no kind of there is no kind of consequence for efficiency. But if you do not have the possibility to use lump sum taxes, because, for instance, you think about equality or something like this, and then lump sum taxes are taking the same fixed value away from everybody, this is a little bit unfeasible in a situation like this, because you would like to kind of increase or have higher taxes for individuals with higher ability to produce or something like this. Yeah, so lump sum taxes might be unfeasible in some situations. And if you're using taxes which are causing distortions, then they should be so. The way that you finance the public good should be explicitly considered in the optimization problem. And the paper has an issue with the previous literature because this topic, so to answer how this distortion changes the amount of public goods which should be produced, so the literature had either informal arguments or it was unclear. So the literature was unclear on whether the consideration of taxes yields over or under supply of a public good relative to the Samuelson condition. So it was not very precise. So the previous literature was not very precise on yet. Does the consideration, or when does the consideration of distortion taxes or distortive taxes yield over or under supply relative to the benchmark model in the Samuelson paper? And the paper here is shedding light on this issue. And what the authors are basically doing is that they derive a so-called appropriate benefit measure for a marginal increase in the quantity of the public good. And in particular, this means that if you consider the Samuelson condition in the most easiest way that we had in the lecture in proposition 1, the benefit measure there was simply the sum of marginal utilities of the public good. Okay, so this was the benefit measure in the Samuelson condition. And the authors then here are kind of generalizing this by including possible distortions caused by taxes to finance the public good. So the kind of optimality condition for the quantity of the public good differs in this paper here. And as a consequence, the measure that they consider includes the true costs of a public good. And using this measure, the authors are then conducting a cost-benefit analysis of a marginal increase of the public good, and this yields an appropriate output level of the public goods. And then they conclude by comparing the efficient or the optimal output level of a public good when there are only lump sum taxes available. So this is the Samuelson case, and with the case where only commodity taxes are available, which are basically the taxes which are, or the distortion taxes which are used in this paper here. So as I stated just right now, this model here includes commodity factor taxes to finance public goods. So commodity taxes are taxes on consumption of the outputs, and factor taxes are taxes on the use of inputs. Okay, so think of taxing, I don't know, wood or something like this, or if one of the factors here is labor, then think of a tax on labor. Then in the base model of the paper, the public goods and private goods can either be substitutes or complements. Yeah, so one example. Let me just really quickly think of an example. Yes, so one example could be, so consider a public good to be a highway and a private good to be cars, okay? And in this case, the public good highway and the private good car are complements, because the more and the better highways you have, the more it increases the demand of cars. And at the same time, if there are a lot of people who are using cars, you could imagine that there is an incentive to build better highways or more highways. Yeah, so this is one example on how a public good and a private good can be complements. And substitutes, I mean, what could be a substitute? Yes, so substitute could be, for instance, if you consider television channels, you have private channels, as for instance in Germany, you have RTL, ProSieben, and all of those channels. And a public good could be the öffentlich-rechtliche channels, so the ARD and ZDF. And those are basic, you can consider them as substitutes. Yeah? So that if the government introduces more television channels, this so this drives consumption away from the private channels to the public channels, and vice versa. So those are kind of examples for substitutes or substitutability between public goods and private goods. What the authors do is they derive an adjusted version of the Samuelson condition, which then differs in the marginal benefit of a marginal increase of a public good. Yeah, so it will not simply be the sum of marginal utilities for the public good, but it will differ. And what they basically find is that if a public good and a private good, which is taxed, okay, the private good is taxed, and if the public good and the private good, which is taxed, are complements, then this reduces the revenue needed to finance the public good. And the reason for this, so one example would be that if, for instance, there is a tax on cars and the government is building more highways, one consequence could be that building this highway could increase the demand for cars, and hence, due to an increase in the demand of cars, the tax revenue is increasing since cars are taxed. And then the investment into the public good, so highways, increases the revenue automatically. Yeah, so there is kind of a feedback effect there. And as a consequence of this complementarity, there is an increase in the benefit measure relative to the Samuelson condition. Yeah, so if you marginally increase the amount of the public good, there is not only a benefit due to a marginal increase of the utilities for the individuals, but there is also kind of a feedback effect, since this investment is the investment into the public good is financing itself through this complementarity. So this increases the benefit measure. So it's not only the sum of individual benefits, but it's also additional condition is that we need less revenue to finance this product, and this kind of the savings that we made can be used to increase consumption of outputs or anything else, and hence, this increases the benefit measure. Now the paper then proceeds to abstract from complementarities and substitutes to then show that even in this case, if we do not have complementarity or substitutability between private goods and public goods, then we still have two effects which are then remaining, and those effects yield a different benefit measure of a marginal public good increase than what we had in the Samuelson condition. And the conditions are, or the two effects are the distortionary effect and the revenue effect. And the distortionary effect is basically capturing a feature of a commodity tax in that it is causing distortions because it changes the relative prices of goods. Yeah, and this reduces welfare. And since it's reducing welfare, this distortionary effect decreases the benefit measure of a marginal public good increase because of the distortions. Yeah, so if we have to finance the public good by using commodity taxes which cause distortion, this changes the benefit measure of a marginal public good increase by decreasing it basically. And we have to consider this kind of this effect when we are thinking about how much of the public good we're actually producing. The second effect is the revenue effect. Keep in mind the distortion effect here, this is always strictly negative, so it decreases the benefit measure of a marginal public good increase. The revenue effect, on the other hand, can be positive and it can be negative. And the idea of the revenue effect is the following. So if we have taxes, then there is an income effect, because so an income effect is kind of a change in your relative income due to either an increase in your actual income or a change in the prices in the economy, because like your purchasing power, so how much you can consume, does not only depend on your income but also on the prices. Yeah, so those are the real prices or the real income. And if you tax, there is an income effect. Yeah, so there is a reduction, there is a decrease in your real income. And this reduces the revenue from a commodity tax on consumption goods. Yeah, and the reason is simply because your real income is decreasing, and hence you can, in real terms, consume less of the output goods, and this decreases the revenue. But it increases the revenue from an input tax if consumers are kind of replying by this tax in order by working more, so by decreasing their leisure. And by working more, they need inputs. And if those inputs are taxed, then the consumers are then increasing the revenue again. And this depends crucially on how the consumers are reacting if there is a commodity tax on output goods. Yeah, so the sign of this revenue effect can be negative, but it can also be positive depending on what type of good leisure is. Yeah, and if leisure is a normal good, so if the price of leisure is increasing, then you will have a negative sign. No, it's a positive sign then with respect to the revenue due to input taxes. Okay, so then it's unclear what kind of sign the total revenue effect will have. On the other hand, if leisure is not a normal good and people then basically work even less, then you basically have the same sign on both effects for the revenue effect, and hence the sign will be also negative in total. So the argument here is basically that even if we abstract from complementarities and substitutability between public and private goods, there can still be, or there is still kind of a different benefit measure of a marginal public good increase relative to the Samuelson conditions. The paper then is concluding by comparing the optimal output levels of public goods under lump sum taxes and distorting commodity taxes. So it's considering the model that just arrived when we only have lump sum taxes, and then you basically end up with the original Samuelson condition, which then will be used to derive the output by also using a balancing condition. And then we are considering commodity taxes, and by comparing the two results, the paper basically shows that the public good provision is lower in commodity tax optimum than in lump sum optimum. Yeah, so compared to what the Samuelson condition was stating, so with condition number 2, so I think it was condition number 2 in proposition 1, when you only have lump sum taxes, or when you have lump sum taxes available, the result in this paper is saying that this is if you consider distortions due to, for instance, commodity taxes, the public good provision is lower because we need to consider the distortions of financing public goods when we are thinking about public goods. Yeah, and this is kind of the main point made in the Atkinson and Stern paper. And this finishes this week's problem set or paper session. So we had kind of two short papers this time, but since in the past some of the exercises were longer than 90 minutes, it's okay if this time we have a shorter exercise session. And yes, if you have questions with respect to the papers, I uploaded both of them on Moodle. Please let me know. And otherwise, see you next week for the exercise session where we will deal with the topic of, I think, externalities, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, see you next week.